Her light, the winter I learned to save myself a seat. Are you someone who has ever felt invisible in your own family? Someone who gives and gives until there is nothing left, only to discover you were never truly seen at all. If you have ever found yourself nodding in the shadows while others make decisions about your life, this story is for you. Drop a comment below about a time you had to choose yourself over family expectations. I read every single one, and your stories matter. Now, let me tell you about the winter that changed everything for me. At Sunday brunch, my daughter-in-law Amanda looked me straight in the eye and said, "We have made the decision to spend Christmas, just the four of us this year." I simply nodded, as if she would just mentioned the weather forecast. My name is Eleanor Richardson, though most people call me Ellie. I am 68 years old, and I live alone in a small colonial house in Millfield, Connecticut, where the winters settle into your bones like old memories that refuse to fade. If you are listening to this while sitting in your own quiet kitchen, watching steam rise from a cup of tea that has gone cold, then perhaps you understand the kind of silence I am talking about. For decades, I was the woman who remembered every birthday, who showed up early to help with holiday preparations, who never missed a school play or soccer game. I was the grandmother who kept photo albums updated, the mother who answered every phone call on the first ring. But somewhere along the way, I became furniture in my own family's story, useful when they needed something moved or fixed, but otherwise just part of the background scenery. This past December, for the first time in 37 years, I wasn't invited to Christmas. Not because I would done anything wrong, but because I would simply existed too long in the periphery, like a lamp that gives light for so many years that no one notices when it finally burns out. I am not sharing this story to seek sympathy or to cast blame. I am telling it because maybe there is someone else out there who recognizes the weight of always being the one who accommodates, who sacrifices, who smiles and nods even when their heart is breaking. If that sounds familiar, pour yourself something warm and settle in. Let me tell you about the season I finally learned the difference between being loved and being needed, and how sometimes saving yourself requires the courage to walk away from everything you have built. That December morning started like any other Sunday at Maple and Mint Bistro, the little restaurant where I would been meeting Michael and Amanda for monthly brunches for the past 6 years. The place has exposed brick walls, painted a soft cream color, with trailing ivy and copper planters and jazz music, playing just low enough to create atmosphere, without drowning out conversation. I always arrived 15 minutes early and chose the corner table by the large windows, where I could watch the early shoppers hurrying past with their coffee cups and weekend errands. The waitress, Carmen, a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, brought me my usual chamomile tea without being asked. "The cinnamon scone again today, Mrs. Richardson?" she asked, setting down the delicate china cup with its tiny chip near the handle, a flaw I would grown fond of over the months. "Please, dear," I replied, settling my reading glasses on the small chain around my neck. I would brought a paperback mystery novel, more as a prop than anything else. These brunches rarely involved much actual conversation, more like brief family status reports, delivered between bites of Eggs Benedict and glances at phones. Michael arrived first, as he usually did, looking slightly rumpled in his weekend flannel shirt and jeans. At 43, he still had the same habit of running his hand through his graying hair when he was uncomfortable, something he would done since childhood. He slid into the chair across from me without removing his jacket, which told me this wouldn't be a long visit. Amanda followed a few minutes later, precise as always in her movements and timing. She wore a burgundy sweater that complemented her auburn hair, which was pulled back in the kind of effortless ponytail that actually required considerable effort to achieve. She was one of those women who managed to look put together even on casual Sundays, the kind of person who probably alphabetized her spice rack and color-coordinated her children's closets. I didn't bother asking about the children, Sophie, who was 14 and perpetually attached to her phone, and Ryan, who was 11 and obsessed with video games. These conversations had a rhythm, and personal questions weren't part of the choreography. Amanda ordered her green tea with honey and glanced at her watch before looking directly at me. "Eleanor," she began, using my full name the way she did when she was about to deliver news she considered important. Michael and I have been discussing the holidays, and we have made the decision to spend Christmas, just the four of us, this year. I set down my teacup carefully, the small clink against the saucer, the only sound for a moment. I see, I said, nodding as if she would just informed me of a change in their insurance policy or a new pediatrician for the children. Michael shifted in his seat, studying the pattern on the tablecloth as if it contained secrets. He would inherited his father's tendency to avoid conflict, though James had at least possessed the backbone to defend what mattered to him. Our son seemed to have missed that particular genetic trait. Sophie's at that age where she wants more independence, Amanda continued, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she used when explaining why certain decisions were non-negotiable. And with Ryan's school schedule being so demanding, we thought a quieter celebration would be better for everyone. You understand, it wasn't a question. It was a statement packaged as consideration, the way people announce they are doing you a favor by excluding you from your own family traditions. I nodded again, this gesture that had become my default response to their pronouncements over the years. Of course, I said, reaching for my purse. I assume I will be paying for my own meal today. I placed exact change on the table, including Carmen's usual tip, and stood up. The scone sat untouched on the small plate, still warm from the oven. Amanda's mouth opened slightly, as if she would expected more of a reaction, perhaps tears or protests, or the kind of emotional scene that would justify their decision to exclude me. Eleanor, Michael said, finally looking up from the tablecloth, but I was already stepping away from the table. Thank you for letting me know, I said, pulling on my wool coat. I hope you have a lovely holiday. I walked out of Maple and Mint without looking back. Past Carmen, who was approaching with a fresh pot of tea, past the other families enjoying their Sunday brunches, past the life I would thought I was still part of until exactly 3 minutes earlier. The December air hit my face like a splash of cold water, sharp enough to make my eyes tear, but not enough to numb the strange hollowness that had opened up in my chest. The sidewalks were busy with weekend activity couples, walking dogs, teenagers clustered outside the coffee shop, families loading shopping bags into their cars. Everyone seemed to be moving with purpose, heading somewhere they were expected, somewhere they belonged. I walked slowly toward my car, not because my legs were unsteady, but because there was no urgency in my destination. For the first time in decades, I had nowhere I needed to be. No preparations to make, no one waiting for my contribution to their holiday celebration. The realization should have felt liberating, but instead it felt like stepping into an empty room where all the furniture had been removed without notice. As I passed the antique shop, where I used to take Sophie to look at vintage dolls, I caught my reflection in the window. A woman in her late 60s, gray hair neatly styled, wearing a camel-colored coat that had seen better years but was still presentable. I looked like someone's grandmother, someone's mother, someone who belonged somewhere, but appearances, I was learning, could be deceiving. I reached my car, a reliable sedan that had served me well for 8 years, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. The radio came on automatically, playing some cheerful Christmas song about families gathering and hearts being warm. I turned it off and drove home in silence, past houses already decorated with lights and wreaths, past the elementary school, where I would volunteered for years reading to first graders, past the life I would built around the assumption that being useful meant being valued. My house sat on Elm Street, a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters that needed painting and a front porch where I kept a small garden of winter pansies. It was the same house where Michael had learned to ride a bicycle, where we would hosted Easter egg hunts and birthday parties, where James and I had planned to grow old together before cancer changed those plans 7 years earlier. Now it felt too large for one person, too quiet for the echoes of all those years of family dinners and holiday mornings. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar hallway, where photographs of graduations and wedding days and grandchildren's milestones lined the walls like evidence of a life well lived. But looking at them now, I noticed something I would never seen before in almost every picture. I was the one taking the photo. I was present, but not included, recording everyone else's joy while remaining just outside the frame. In the living room, the Christmas decorations I would put up in early December sat waiting for a celebration that would never come. The small artificial tree with its carefully hung ornaments collected over decades. The garland draped along the mantelpiece. The stockings I would hung out of habit, even though no one would be coming to fill them. It all looked suddenly foolish, like a stage set for a play that had been cancelled without notice. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in James's old recliner, which I would kept even though it clashed with the rest of the furniture. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard. It was the kind of peaceful winter scene that belonged on greeting cards, the kind of day that should have been spent with family, preparing for the holidays, sharing stories and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of multiple generations under one roof. Instead, I sat alone with the growing awareness that I would been living on the margins of my own life for longer than I cared to admit. I would become so accustomed to accommodating everyone else's needs, to smoothing over conflicts and filling in gaps, that I would forgotten what it felt like to be essential rather than merely convenient. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet. For a moment, my heart jumped with the hope that maybe Michael had called to apologize, to say they would made a mistake, that Christmas wouldn't be the same without me. But when I answered, it was just a telemarketer selling insurance. Someone reading from a script who couldn't possibly understand that they would caught me at the exact moment when I was questioning the value of everything I would thought I was protecting. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my financial records and spread them across the dining room table. As a retired bookkeeper who had managed accounts for small businesses for 30 years, I understood numbers in a way that many people didn't. I could read patterns in spreadsheets like other people read novels, finding stories in the columns of income and expenses, the steady rhythm of deposits and withdrawals that told the real story of how life was actually lived. What I found in my own records shocked me, not because the amounts were unexpected, but because I would never added them up all at once. Monthly insurance payments for Michael's family when he would been between jobs 18 months at $400 per month. The down payment I would provided for Amanda's car when their credit couldn't secure a loan, $8,500. Ryan's summer camp fees for 3 consecutive years, $4,200. Sophie's orthodontic work when their insurance wouldn't cover the full amount, $3,800. Emergency funds for home repairs, medical bills, school expenses, the countless small amounts that never seemed significant individually, but had drained away nearly $180,000 from my retirement savings over the past decade. Not once had anyone asked if I could afford these contributions. They would simply presented the problems to me as if my financial support was an assumption rather than a gift. I would never demanded repayment or even acknowledgement, telling myself that this was what mothers and grandmothers did, they sacrificed for their families without keeping score. But sitting at my dining room table with the evidence spread before me, I realized I would been keeping score all along. I would just been afraid to look at the total. I called my financial advisor, Robert Manning, a patient man who had helped me navigate the complexities of retirement planning after James died. "Eleanor," he said when I reached him, "is everything all right?" "You sound concerned. I need to review all my automatic transfers and authorized payments," I told him. "And I would like to discuss restructuring my accounts to prevent unauthorized access." There was a pause. "Has something happened?" "I am just taking better care of my finances," I said, which was true without being entirely honest. "When can we meet?" We scheduled an appointment for the following week. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet house and realized this was the first decision I would made in months that was solely for my benefit. It felt strange and slightly guilty, like taking the last piece of cake at a party, but also necessary in a way I couldn't fully explain. That evening, I called my friend Patricia Whitman, whom I would known since our children attended the same elementary school. Patricia was a widow like me, but her relationship with her adult children had always been more balanced. She would once told me that the secret to maintaining good relationships with grown children was never becoming too available, never letting them forget that you had a life of your own. "Ellie," she said when she answered, "how are you holding up? I know the holidays can be difficult." I told her about the brunch, about Amanda's announcement, about the strange relief I would felt walking away from their table. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding. "You know," she said when I finished, "my daughter tried something similar a few years ago. Told me they wanted a simpler Christmas, just their immediate family. I said that sounded lovely and made plans to spend the holiday in Florida with my sister, when they realized I wasn't going to sit home waiting for them to change their minds. Suddenly, the holiday wasn't too complicated for one more person." "What did you do?" "I went to Florida anyway," Patricia laughed. "Had the most relaxing Christmas I would had in years. Sometimes our children need to be reminded that we existed before they were born, and we will continue to exist whether they include us or not." After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the cottage. James and I had bought a small cabin on Clearwater Pond, about an hour outside of town, originally intending it as a weekend retreat where we could escape the demands of work and parenthood. After James died, I would maintained it but rarely used it, visiting only to ensure the pipes didn't freeze and the roof remained intact. It had been years since I would spent more than an afternoon there, but now, as I sat in my too quiet house surrounded by Christmas decorations that felt more like accusations than celebrations, the cottage began to seem like exactly what I needed: a place where I could remember who I was when I wasn't defined by my usefulness to other people. The next morning, I began packing. Not running away exactly, but choosing a place where I could think clearly without the constant reminders of all the ways I would made myself indispensable to people who would apparently decided they could do without me. I packed warm clothes, some favorite books, enough food for a week, and the Christmas ornaments that held actual meaning for me, the ones James and I had collected during our travels. The handmade decorations Michael had crafted in elementary school. The few items that represented joy rather than obligation. I left no note, made no dramatic announcements. I simply locked the house and drove to Clearwater Pond, where the winter silence was honest rather than accusatory, where I could begin the work of remembering what Eleanor Richardson wanted from the years she had left. The cottage sat among tall pines on a gravel road that wound around the lake. It was small but well-built, with a stone fireplace that James had constructed himself and wide windows that faced the water. In summer, the view was green and lush, full of life and movement. But in winter, with the lake frozen and the trees bare, it had a stark beauty that matched my mood stripped down to essentials, peaceful in its simplicity. I unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar scent of cedar and wood smoke that seemed to live in the walls regardless of how long the place sat empty. The furniture was simple but comfortable: a sofa covered in faded plaid, a dining table that seated 4, bookshelves lined with the novels and poetry collections I would accumulated over the years, but never had time to reread. I started a fire in the fireplace and made coffee in the small kitchen, looking out at the frozen lake where a few brave ducks had found a patch of open water. The silence here was different from the silence in my house in town. This was the silence of snow falling and wind moving through trees, of a world going about its business without requiring anything from me. That afternoon, I took a walk along the lake path, bundled in my warmest coat and boots. The exercise felt good after days of sitting and worrying and trying to understand how I would arrive at this point in my life. Other than a few hardy cross-country skiers in the distance, I saw no one, which suited my mood perfectly. On my way back to the cottage, I encountered Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in the larger cabin near the entrance to the lake community. She was bundling newspapers for recycling, moving slowly but steadily despite the cold. "You are Eleanor Richardson," she said when she saw me, as if she would been expecting this meeting. "I remember you from the summers when your husband was alive. I was sorry to hear about his passing." "Thank you," I said, touched that she would remembered. "Are you spending the winter here?" "Every winter for the past 5 years," she replied. "My children think I am crazy, but I have discovered that solitude and loneliness are entirely different things. Out here, I am solitary by choice. In the city, I was lonely despite being surrounded by people." Her words stayed with me as I returned to the cottage. Solitary by choice rather than lonely by default. There was dignity in that distinction, a sense of agency that I would been missing for too long. That evening, I set up a small Christmas tree using pine branches I would gather during my walk, decorating it with the ornaments that actually meant something to me. I cooked a simple dinner and ate it by the fire, reading a mystery novel I would been meaning to finish for months. For the first time in weeks, I felt peaceful rather than anxious, present in my own life rather than waiting for someone else to decide what role I was allowed to play. On my third day at the cottage, I woke to find fresh snow covering everything in a pristine blanket of white. The world looked newly made, clean and full of possibility. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching cardinals and blue jays compete for seeds at the feeder misses Chen had mentioned was maintained by the Lake Association. That is when I saw the familiar silver SUV making its way slowly down the gravel road toward my cottage. Even from a distance, I recognized Michael's careful driving style, the way he navigated the curves as if he was afraid of damaging something valuable. My first instinct was panic. Something must be wrong. Someone must be hurt for them to track me down here. But as the vehicle came closer and I saw Amanda in the passenger seat, I realized this wasn't an emergency. This was a mission. I didn't rush to open the door when they knocked. I finished my coffee, put on my cardigan, and took my time crossing the small living room. When I finally opened the door, I found Michael and Amanda standing on the small porch, looking uncomfortable and slightly guilty, like children who had been caught in mischief. "Mom," Michael said, his breath visible in the cold air. "We were worried when you didn't answer your phone." "My phone is fine," I replied calmly. "I simply chose not to answer it. Would you like to come in? There is coffee." They entered hesitantly, as if they weren't sure of their welcome. Amanda carried a wrapped package that looked suspiciously like a peace offering, and Michael's eyes swept the cottage with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "The place looks good," he said, settling onto the sofa. I forgot how cozy it could be. I poured coffee for all of us, noting that Amanda declined the sugar I offered, and Michael added more cream than usual, small signs of nervousness that I recognized from years of observing my family's habits. When we were all seated around the small coffee table, an awkward silence settled over us. "Eleanor," Amanda began, using that careful tone again, "I think there may have been a misunderstanding about Christmas." "No misunderstanding," I replied. "You were quite clear about your decision." Michael shifted uncomfortably. "We thought maybe you would want some space to grieve Dad. It has been hard, all the holidays without him." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of considerate gesture that sounded thoughtful when spoken aloud. But I knew my son well enough to recognize retroactive justification when I heard it. This wasn't about grief, this was about convenience. "That is very thoughtful," I said, "and you were right, I did need space. I have been doing quite well here on my own." Amanda opened the package she would brought, revealing a beautiful hand-knitted scarf in shades of blue and gray. "Sophie made this for you in her home economics class. She was quite proud of it." The scarf was lovely, clearly the work of many hours and considerable care. I accepted it and wrapped it around my shoulders, genuinely touched by my granddaughter's effort. But I also recognized it for what it was, a token meant to soften my resistance to whatever proposal they would come to make. "Please tell Sophie, I am honored to receive something she made herself," I said. "It is beautiful work. She would love to tell you herself," Michael said. "She and Ryan have been asking about you." "Have they?" I asked. "How unusual." "They have seemed quite capable of existing without their grandmother's presence for the past several months." The words came out more sharply than I would intended, carrying years of accumulated disappointment that I would never allowed myself to express. Michael flinched, as if I would slapped him. "Mom, that is not fair." "We have all been busy, I repeated. "Yes, I understand. Too busy for phone calls or visits, but not too busy to cash the checks I send for school expenses and medical bills." Amanda's cheeks flushed pink. "We have always been grateful for your help, grateful enough to assume it would continue indefinitely. Regardless of whether I was invited to participate in the family, I have been supporting financially for years." The silence that followed was thick with uncomfortable truths that had never been spoken aloud. I could see Michael processing the implications of my words. perhaps for the first time considering the cost of his assumptions about his mother's availability and resources. "We didn't realize," he began, but I held up my hand. "You didn't realize because you never asked," I said. "You simply presented me with problems and expected solutions, as if I existed solely to smooth over the difficulties in your lives." Amanda set down her coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly. "That is not how we see you, Eleanor, isn't it? When was the last time any of you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you invited me to something because you wanted my company, rather than because you needed my help?" They had no answer because we all knew there wasn't one. For years, our relationship had been transactional. They needed something. I provided it, and everyone pretended this was the natural order of families. "We want to fix this," Michael said finally. "Tell us how to fix this." I looked at my son. This man I would raise to be kind and responsible, who would somehow learn that women mothers, wives, grandmothers existed to make his life easier without requiring anything in return. It wasn't entirely his fault. I would train him to think this way through years of accommodating his needs without expressing my own. "You cannot fix this, Michael," I said gently. "Because this isn't broken. This is me finally learning to live according to my own terms, instead of constantly adjusting to everyone else's." "So what does that mean?" Amanda asked. "Are you cutting us out of your life?" "I am not cutting anyone out," I replied. "I am just no longer arranging my life around the assumption that I will be included in yours. If you want a relationship with me, we will need to build something new, something based on mutual respect rather than convenient utility." They stayed for another hour, and the conversation gradually grew easier as we talked about neutral topics: the cottage, the weather, Mrs. Chen's determination to spend winter at the lake. But underneath the polite chit-chat, I could sense them recalibrating their understanding of who I was and what I was willing to accept. When they finally left, promising to think about everything and be in touch soon, I felt neither victorious nor defeated. I felt, for perhaps the first time in years, honest. I would spoken the truth about my feelings and my needs without apologizing for having them. And the world hadn't ended. That evening, I called Patricia to tell her about the visit. She listened with the kind of attention that only comes from someone who has navigated similar waters. "How do you feel?" she asked when I finished. "Scared," I admitted, but also relieved. Like I have been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. "Good," she said. "Healthy relationships require honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, especially when it is uncomfortable." I spent 2 more weeks at the cottage, using the solitude to think about what I wanted my life to look like going forward. I read books I would been meaning to read for years, took long walks around the frozen lake, and had several more conversations with Mrs. Chen, who turned out to be a retired social worker with fascinating stories about helping families navigate difficult transitions. When I finally returned to town, it was because I would made a decision about how to spend my time and energy, not because anyone had summoned me home. I found my house exactly as I would left it, the Christmas decorations still in place, the answering machine blinking with messages I listened to without urgency. Most of the calls were from telemarketers or automated reminders about appointments. But there were 3 from Michael, growing progressively more conciliatory in tone, and 1 from Sophie, asking if I was okay and saying she missed me. That last message, delivered in the uncertain voice of a teenager who wasn't sure of her reception, touched me more than all of Michael's apologies combined. I called Sophie back first. "Grandma Ellie," she said when she answered. Relief evident in her voice. "Mom said you went to the lake house. Are you okay?" "I am fine, sweetheart," I told her. "I just needed some time to think. How are you doing?" We talked for nearly an hour about school and friends and her upcoming driver's test. The kind of rambling conversation I would missed more than I would realized. Before we hung up, Sophie asked, "Grandma, would you maybe want to have lunch with just me sometime? I mean, without the parents around?" "I would love that," I said, and meant it. "How about this Saturday? Really? Just us?" "Just us," I confirmed, and heard the smile in her voice when she said goodbye. Michael called that evening, his tone more careful than it had been in years. "Mom, "I owe you an apology," he began. "Several apologies, actually. I am listening," I said, settling into James's chair with a cup of tea. "We have been taking you for granted," he said. "Not just at Christmas, but for years. We got so used to you being there whenever we needed something that we forgot you might need things too. What kinds of things do you think I need, Michael?" There was a pause while he considered this, as if the question had never occurred to him before. "I don't know," he said finally. "I should know. But I don't. Will you tell me?" It was a simple request, but it represented a fundamental shift in our relationship. For the first time in years, he was asking about my needs rather than assuming I didn't have any. "I need to feel valued for who I am, not just for what I can provide," I said. "I need to be included in family decisions that affect me, not just informed about them after they have been made. And I need to know that my presence is wanted, not just tolerated." "Can we start over?" he asked. "Try to do better?" "We can try," I said. "But it will take time, and it will require effort from everyone, not just good intentions." The conversation marked the beginning of a gradual reconstruction of our relationship. It wasn't easy or automatic. Years of ingrained patterns don't change overnight. But slowly, tentatively, we began building something new. Amanda called a few days later to apologize for her part in the Christmas decision, and to ask if I would be willing to join them for New Year's dinner, not as the cook or organizer, but as a guest. When I arrived, I found the table already set, the meal already prepared, and my family genuinely glad to see me, rather than relieved that I would arrive to solve some problem. It was a small gesture, but it represented progress. For the first time in years, I was invited to participate rather than summoned to serve. Over the following months, our relationship continued to evolve. Sophie and I established our monthly lunch tradition, during which she told me about her life, and I told her stories about mine, treating each other as individuals rather than just relatives. Ryan, initially shy after months of minimal contact, gradually warmed up during family dinners that rotated between houses, so the burden of hosting didn't always fall on the same person. Michael made an effort to call regularly, asking about my activities and opinions rather than just my availability to solve problems. Amanda, perhaps recognizing that her approach had been counterproductive, began treating me as an adult family member rather than an aging dependent who needed decisions made for her. Most importantly, I stopped automatically saying yes to every request for help. When Michael mentioned needing money for home repairs, I suggested he research loan options first. When Amanda complained about the cost of Sophie's college preparations, I listened sympathetically but didn't offer to write a check. I helped when I chose to help, not because I felt obligated or afraid of being excluded if I refused. The financial advisor I would consulted helped me restructure my accounts to protect my retirement savings and ensure that any future financial assistance would be deliberate rather than reflexive. I discovered that having boundaries actually made my occasional generosity more meaningful to both the giver and receiver. As winter gave way to spring, I also began exploring activities that interested me rather than just being available for whatever my family needed. I joined the volunteer reading program at the local library, where I discovered I enjoyed sharing stories with children who appreciated them. I took a photography class at the community college and began documenting the changing seasons around Clearwater Pond. I also developed a friendship with Mrs. Chen, whose insights about aging gracefully helped me understand that this phase of life could be about growth and discovery rather than just managing decline. We met for coffee once a week. Two women who would learn that solitude and loneliness were indeed different things, and that choosing your own company was sometimes the greatest gift you could give yourself. By the time the following Christmas approached, our family dynamics had stabilized into something healthier and more sustainable. When Amanda asked if I would like to host Christmas dinner, I said yes, because I wanted to, not because I felt I had to. When Michael offered to contribute both money and labor to the preparations, I accepted because it felt like partnership rather than charity. Sophie helped me decorate the tree, sharing memories of ornaments she would forgotten she would made in elementary school. Ryan, now 12 and slightly more communicative, helped me arrange furniture to accommodate everyone comfortably. The dinner itself was joyful rather than obligatory, filled with genuine conversation and laughter rather than the careful politeness that had characterized our gatherings for too long. As I watched my family enjoying themselves in my home, I realized that the year I would almost lost them had actually been the year I would found myself. By refusing to accept being taken for granted, I would created space for more authentic relationships to develop. By choosing solitude over loneliness, I would discovered what I actually wanted from the years I had left. That evening, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up the remnants of our celebration, I found myself thinking about other women my age who might be struggling with similar feelings of invisibility and diminished worth. How many mothers and grandmothers were silently accommodating treatment that made them feel like furniture rather than family members? I thought about the conversation Patricia and I had shared about the difference between being loved and being needed, and how easy it was to confuse the two when you had spent years defining your value through your usefulness to others. I thought about Mrs. Chen's wisdom about solitude being a choice rather than a sentence, and how frightening but necessary it sometimes was to step away from familiar patterns that no longer served you. Most of all, I thought about the conversation I would had with Sophie just a few weeks earlier, when she would ask me what advice I would give to other women facing difficult family situations. Tell them they are allowed to save a seat for themselves, I would said. Not just at the dinner table, but in their own lives. Tell them that being kind doesn't mean being convenient, and that being loving doesn't mean being available for exploitation. What if their families don't understand? Sophie had asked. Then they will learn, I would replied, or they will not. But either way, you will know you treated yourself with the same kindness you have always shown everyone else. Now, standing in my kitchen on the night after Christmas, surrounded by the evidence of a celebration that had included me as a valued participant rather than just a service provider, I felt grateful for the courage I would found to save that seat for myself. It had been the hardest thing I would ever done, walking away from patterns that felt like love but were really just habit. But it had also been the most important thing I would ever done. If you are reading this story and recognizing yourself in it, I want you to know that it is never too late to change the terms of your relationships. It is never too late to require the respect you have always deserved. And it is never too late to discover that the person whose company you should value most is your own. The winter I learned to save myself a seat was the winter I finally understood that true family love isn't about one person constantly sacrificing for everyone else. It is about everyone caring enough to make space for each other's needs, dreams, and dignity. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is teaching them how to love you better. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from relationships that don't honor who you are, trusting that the people who truly care about you will find a way to follow. That is my story about the winter everything changed, when I finally learned that being a loving mother and grandmother didn't mean accepting whatever treatment my family chose to give me. Sometimes love means setting boundaries even when it is scary, especially when it is scary. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear about your own experiences with family boundaries in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose yourself over family expectations? How did it turn out? Your stories help other people feel less alone in their struggles, and I read every single comment. Don't forget to subscribe to Her Light for more stories about finding your strength in life's most challenging moments, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Tomorrow I will be sharing another story about a woman who discovered her worth after years of being overlooked. You will not want to miss it. Remember, you deserve a seat at your own table. Never let anyone convince you otherwise.